Okay, we are recording now. My name is Rob Packard. This is a webinar with Jane Gates. She's a packaging expert. Her consulting company is Packwise Consulting, and she was generous enough to give her time today to answer some questions for people about packaging validation and explain that packaging validation is more than just packaging validation. It also involves shelf life and distribution. So if you would like, Jan, maybe you can walk us through these slides. The first slide here is just her cover slide giving contact information.
Well, no contact information there,
Okay.
but you can do Packwise Consulting. So yeah, I'll start talking. This is just a short bio. I say I have 35 years plus because I don't want to tell you how many years I actually do have in packaging. 25 have been in medical devices, so I got to see the QSRs come through. I've worked with design, material and distribution testing, material and equipment validations, PMA submissions, some 510Ks, REACH ROHA. If you don't know what that is, it's something to do with chemicals of concerns or materials of concern. The packaging waste directives, which I think are very, very good for people to go into if they're worried about sustainability and sustainability itself. I also have been the president of my professional society, and I work with IOPP, which is Institute of Packaging Professionals. It's the packaging professional group out there. I'm on their medical device packaging technical committee. One thing I have learned working in medical devices, you get a lot of acronyms, so you try and use those as much as possible. Otherwise, you'll be talking forever. So I work with ASTM on the FO2 and the D10 committees. I would advise everybody to join that if possible. You do not have to be a voting member, but it's only $75 a year, and you can get download all of the standards you need for package testing. I am a subcommittee chair at this point in time. It's only for the D10.96, which is a liaison for what's going on in the ISO packaging community. I also work with another subcommittee that doesn't have a lot of activity right now, but it's for new packaging that doesn't fit into anything else so that we can have a place to develop standards. I am working with several ISO committees. I'm currently a convener, which means I get to call all the meetings for the packaging terminology. Unfortunately, it's 5 a.m. usually for me, so I can get everybody else to around the world to be included. I am the US tag liaison for all the packaging standards that are in the TC 122, which means I have to find everybody to look at standards they're trying to develop and give me comments so the US can have a vote or comments to how to change things in those committees. And I'm also an SME, subject matter expert, on the WG13, which is labeling, and the WG16, which is a new one that's come out, and they're trying to develop standards for unsterile medical devices. I have a couple more slides just to give you an idea of what I worked on. So you want to do the next slide? Go back. These are some of my old works. My only claim to fame everybody knows about is inventing microwave popcorn. But I've also worked on some of these other aspects, which were fun to do. It's just, there's only so much you want to do with plastic bottles and corrugated. So I got into medical devices because they were much more fun. So the next one shows my just a few things I've worked on with medical devices because there's NDAs that don't allow you to show a lot of them. So it's been for active and non-active implantables and some of the equipment they use, pre-filled syringes, different types of medical devices, and cold chain shipping. Okay, I wanted to make sure you knew there was a difference between packaging validations. That's all for those slides. And I wanted to make sure you knew there's a difference between packaging validations and packaging qualifications. Packaging qualifications are the different types of tests that you do. Validations puts all those tests together to show that it's actually acceptable or not. And that includes things besides the materials, aging, distribution. You've got to do your risk assessments, incoming, receiving, storage, warehousing, different logistics lanes, and understand the temperatures that are out there and develop your tests so they actually work properly. So I had a lot of questions come through, and I wanted to try and answer those as much as I can. And the first one I had was, what's the difference between bubble testing and dye testing in terms of what you are providing about your packaging seal? And I have some cheat sheets here so I can make sure I gave you the right numbers for the ASTM. Bubble testings by ASTM F2096. It's a whole package integrity test for gross leaks. Gross leaks means they're large. So that only sees about 20, well, it's 250 microns that you can actually test it to. And bacteria is smaller than that. But I have to say that in most cases, when you're doing your packaging test, you're going to have bigger holes. So this is a test that a lot of people use because it's easy and you can, you don't actually have to validate it per se in a normal way, because you actually test each package with a specific hole size before you actually start testing it. So that, I mean, you stick a needle in and you put it under the water and make sure you can see a hole where you stuck it. So that makes it easier to actually use it. The dye test is nice, but you can usually only test one seal at a time instead of the whole package, unless you're wiggling the dye all around. The dye, it's a nice test because it tells you when the hole is really small, but it's really messy and it stains your clothes, it stains your hands, and it just gets all over the place. So people tend to use it as a confirmation for what they think is a hole in a bubble test that they can't really see very well, because it can show you holes down to 50 microns, and there's different ways of doing it. Also, there's a surfactant that's used in the dye test that you can't pour down the drain. It's considered hazardous, and we're still working on how to substitute something else for it that gives you the same results to that 50 micron hole. Hopefully that's a good enough explanation of what the difference is. And it's lucky for us in medical devices that we can use the testing different with a go, no-go gauge and not actually know how small or big your hole is, compared to what the pharmaceutical industry is doing right now, where you have to know what exactly your hole size is that you're testing to. Okay, testing acceptance for burst. Well, burst testing has a lot to do with how much volume of air you're putting in there and what the force is. So you have to develop a test based on what your packages are doing that make sure that you actually see when your seals are going to explode without, well, and knowing when they're weak or not, and whether that is related to what kind of failures you might see in the field or not. Hopefully that's some type of a thing. I've always enjoyed burst testing if I could relate it to seal strength, because seal strength is something that's much easier to measure and more consistent, so you can work through things. I see somebody said they couldn't see my slides. I only had the slides as an introductory type of thing. Now I did ask about testing was asked about testing criteria for burst on corrugated, I believe it was, versus ETC.
Before you go into that, Jan,
yes,
we have these different tests for package integrity, the bubble test, the leak test, the dye penetration, and we have burst test. Which ones of these would you use for validation of the design, and which ones need to be submitted for a regulatory submission?
Normally, you don't have to submit anything on your packaging with your submissions for a medical device. You say whether it passes or fail and what kind of testing you did. But if they ask you for that data, you need to come up and give it to them, usually what, in 24, 48 hours or less than a week. And it takes weeks to try and do those tests. So whatever you pick, you've got to make sure you stay with. I like to use the bubble test because it's easier to use. Burst testing, you need to relate to seal strength somehow, because you need to know weak versus strong so you can set up your testing properly. Burst test to me is something you want to use on the production line to make sure your seals are actually good because it's fast. But it does take a while to get that correlation. On the dye test, I always use it as a follow-up type of test. So to me, bubble testing on a sterile barrier system is the best and easiest way to check to make sure you've got whole package integrity and that it works after you do some kind of performance testing. Is that answering your question?
Well, thank you, Jan.
There was a question about burst tests. I believe it was for corrugated, because there's something called a Mullins burst test versus an ECT test, which tells you about the strength of your corrugated. I came into packaging where we always use a Mullins test instead of an ECT test. ECT, edge crush test, is something that tells you how strong your boxes are for top load. And I remember when the ECT was coming through, it was to allow the corrugated suppliers to use more types of additives in their corrugated and thin out their board because it would give you the same top load strength. Mullins tends to give you information on how good the sidewalls are on your box, some resistance to having something strike it or creases and how that's going to affect your overall top load strength. So now they're coming in to do both of them, ECT and Mullins, in order to make sure that you actually have board that's going to survive distribution properly. So hopefully that's a little bit of a idea. There's college degrees given in paper and paperboard. So I don't even pretend to know all that stuff. I just know I get irritated with the paper community that wants to test everything at 21 degrees C and 50% humidity, which is the optimum temperature and humidity for board to give you good top load and puncture resistance. Well, we don't ship in 21 degrees C and 50% humidity. So to me, we need to do tests at other temperatures and humidities to make sure it actually survives properly, the corrugated box, because that's a structural support that protects your internal parts. And if it isn't holding up, it could really ruin your medical devices that are inside the boxes. Which gets me into another little point I wanted to make sure people knew about. There's a lot of corrugated companies can upgrade the board without calling it a change in materials. So if you're doing a test with a small quantity of board and say you've ordered 200-pound sea flute, well, they might send you a 275-pound sea flute, which is much stronger. And so you're validating or doing all your qualification tests with a stronger board than what you're specifying. So when it goes out in the field later at the real board that you should be or you have specified, you could have failures that way. And I have actually been to conferences talking about corrugated and heard of large companies who weren't checking their basis weight on their corrugated before they did the test and had this happen to them. So when it went to production and started going out in the field, everything started failing. So it's a good thing to learn about your basis weight on your corrugated before you start doing your testing. And it's a simple test. There's actually an ASTM standard or a TAPI standard on that. And you just have to read that standard and see how to do it, because all it takes is a sink in a scale and an oven. Okay, so what is required for 510K? And that's not an easy answer, because it really depends upon your risk assessment and what type of product and classification that you're doing. So I always assume you still got to do something with legibility and human factor testing, as well as the design testing and aging tests that you need to do with your product.
To clarify that one a little bit, in the 510K submission templates, they have a place for shelf life testing. So we have to include some shelf life claims and shelf life testing, or a justification for why we're not claiming a shelf life for the product, or why there's no time-dependent degradation. But there's nothing in there specific to distribution conditioning. There's nothing in there for packaging process validation. The packaging process validation, I've never seen the FDA ask about. I've seen companies include it, but I've never seen the FDA ask for it when they didn't get it. If you put it in there, you're going to get questions. But if you don't put it in there, I've never seen the FDA ask for it. For the conditioning, the distribution conditioning testing, that seems to be less consistent, but I think it's very similar to how people approach sterilization. They don't require that you provide the full test reports for sterilization. They don't require that you provide full test reports for distribution conditioning, but you should be able to summarize, this is the standard we use, this was the acceptance criteria, and it passed. Along with that would be, what was your sample size and what did you define as worst case? So when companies only list the standard, they tend to get requests from reviewers saying, please give us the test report. Whereas when they do a much better job of summarizing what the test method was, what the acceptance criteria was, the sample size, the justification for why the samples were worst case scenario, that helps answer the FDA's questions that, yes, this was done the way we would expect it to a recognized standard, so we don't have any further questions. So you're balancing a line there between people don't want to give the FDA more than they ask for, but if you don't give them enough, they're going to ask for the full test report.
Yes. And when you are doing a packaging, even a design test, rather than a full packaging validation all the way through, you've got to put all those pieces in there. Why is this worst case? What type of aging you did with it? All those pieces go in there. You don't have to give that whole report to the FDA. I've got some right now where we don't even need to put shelf life information in, but that is a non-sterile small medical device that's a class 1 unclassified, or what do you call that? Class 1 non, well, it doesn't have a designation factor with it. So there are times where you don't have to do as much, but usually you do. When you start getting up into the different, excuse me, it's class 3 I meant before. When you start getting into these different classes and how they're classified and stuff, it changes how much you have to do for your packaging. And if we're talking sterile barrier systems, you've got to do a lot more work and have a lot more justification and reports. I'm trying to do a template right now, which would cover pieces for how you might do a packaging distribution test. It's 14 pages, Arial 10 fonts, because of everything that needs to be pointed to and justified in it. So that's not something you want to give to the FDA. I've done protocols before, which were 10 or 15 pages, and I had 2,000 pages of test results. So you need to summarize it, because the FDA would rather not read it all. But if you don't say it right, they're going to ask you for it. I don't know. Hopefully that helps. Somebody asked about sterile bubble and non-sterile packing. I'm assuming that they meant sterile bubble meant a pouch versus a non-sterile. I'm working with some non-sterile product right now, but you still have bacteria, pyrogens, fungi, biocompatibility, and other work that needs to be done with that, and do your packaging properly so you don't have that kind of stuff coming in and contaminating the product. Now, the product's used in an unsterile manner, but you don't want to have all this extra stuff around. So it's still the same kind of packaging work that you need to do. I still need to look and make sure I don't have holes in my pouches and things don't fall apart when I'm shipping. So hopefully that answers that question. What are the standards I need to refer and study? I can't really tell you all of them. I teach a class where I have 3 pages of helpful standards. And I wanted to say the biggest one for sterile packaging is ISO 11607-1 and -2. They're for terminally sterilized medical devices in their packaging. There are 185 other standards mentioned in there, in that one standard. That doesn't mean you need to know all of them, but you need to understand your product and how you're shipping it and what it's used for to know which of these standards you have to also read. There is an ISO TS standard 16775, and it's a guidance document, but it's not written very well at this point in time. They're revising it to make it a little more understandable. They mixed hospital and manufacturing stuff together, so it's hard to pull out the pieces that you actually need in manufacturing versus a hospital. There was another one, Amy TIR 22, that was a little bit easier to understand. Full disclosure, I did help write that one, but they changed it into this ISO standard, and they have to revise it now to make it easier to understand and to include the new changes that have happened in 11607. There's a ASTM D4169, but there are 21 other standards mentioned in that standard. So you have to sort of read them and try and understand them. If you're doing single parcel, ISTA 3A or 3B are pretty easy to read and understand compared to 4169, but it's only for a single parcel. There was a question about ISTA 2A. That is not one you should be using. It's only a partial distribution test and meant more for comparisons between things that have already passed or not. A few other ones that I've used a lot is ASTM F88 for seal strengths, 2096 for bubble, F1980 for accelerated aging. There's an F1886 for visual inspection of seals, but that is not something you can use by itself. You need to have some other kind of mechanical tests to go with it, but it is a good first through to see when you have totally objectionable seals and why do other testing. F6653 for altitude testing. F2097 is great for design and evaluation of medical device sterile packaging. There is F4332 and F2638 for environmental conditioning. And if you read those two standards, the F2638 is better for single parcel post. And there's a whole bunch of FDA guidance documents. I've got 4 pages of that. Some of them are useful and have little bits in there that are quite useful for understanding how the FDA is thinking about packaging. The biggest problem with those is the FDA people have to write those guidance documents to get promoted. So some of them are really not as useful as others, and it's good to take a speed reading class so you can skim through them and see what you might want to need or not sometimes. I'm saying coming soon on the environmental stuff, you've got the ISO 18601 It's 2-6, well, excuse me, 601 to 606. Those are good packaging standards on how to look at your packaging and decide if you've got the minimum packaging necessary, how you might be able to compost it or put it into chemical rehab or get some energy out of it if it's plastic. But there's all sorts of standards coming out all the time. People get into standards groups to try and help people do things easier. So you need to read what they have to say, read their scope, and make sure it's actually applicable for you. I got one on surgical masks that had a whole bunch of questions to it. And I can't answer all of these questions because I haven't had a chance to actually read all the regulations on mask standards. So there was a couple of things that I wanted to point out. One of them was most companies create special validation lots of 250 pieces for validation, and there's nothing left over for testing. Well, this is wrong. You're supposed to use normal lot sizes and pull samples out from your normal lot sizes to do your work. That's why you do your design testing and other stuff up front, because then when you're making your OQ and PQ lots, you're quite sure they're going to pass. And once they pass, you can release them into the general population. So it's not good to do that. Yes?
The reason why all the companies are doing that is because the FDA is saying, we require you to do an AQL 4.0 sampling, general, and I think it's inspection method number 2. But when they're going through this, they're basically going from what used to be test 5 samples for this test and see if it passed, to now a minimum of 32 samples for 3 different non-consecutive lots. And so if you have a lot of, let's say 50,000, which would be a very small lot for a surgical mask, we're talking about hundreds of samples for each lot that would have to be tested. So you'd be looking at over $100,000 in testing to just get through the minimum requirements. So yes, I agree. Normally what you would do is you would do a sampling of a normal production lot, but it's just not cost effective or least burdensome to expect companies to be doing 1,000 masks for an initial validation of their testing. And this would be 1,000 masks for every single test. So 1,000 masks to make sure that it won't catch on fire, 1,000 masks to make sure that the pressure drop is appropriate. And the reason why they implemented or started enforcing the requirements for this statistical sampling was because they were seeing lot-to-lot variability in product coming from China at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And so they just took the knee-jerk reaction of, well, it says this in the standard, so let's enforce it. But they never clarified what would be the maximum requirement for a 510K submission. They just said follow the standard. So if you have a large lot, you end up oversampling and over-testing and spending more money than you need to. So in order to get through the FDA hurdle, everybody's doing sampling of 32. And in order to get the sample size that small, they're doing smaller validation lots. And that's not the intent of the standard, but the regulatory submission used to be test 5. So, and it was testing 5 of one lot. Now we're testing 32 of 3 different lots. If we start testing, so I have the one particular company that submitted that question, they have lot sizes of 1 million.
And I have worked with wound coverings where we made 1 million and took our sampling. I don't understand the AQL business because that is meant for, it's meant for consecutive lots of at least 5. So where they came up with the AQL of 4% doesn't make sense to me because we need to look at the RQL. AQL is only a producer risk not the consumer risk. So if you are balancing those out, there should be a different way of doing that sampling, and you'd have to look at that. I would have to study it and see what to do about it, because that just doesn't make sense statistically, or with the way the regulations are written for medical devices. So
I agree, but it's the FDA hasn't done a good job of explaining why they're doing this, other than to say we're seeing lot to lot variability, so you shall do this, and it shall be a minimum of 32 samples. But they're the people that I'm speaking with at the FDA, they have never done any testing. They've never done any product development, and they're applying this to a very low risk device. It's a mask that's non-sterile and doesn't have any shelf life issues. The issue this customer actually had was they want to claim a shelf life, and so they're trying to figure out, what do we need to do for testing when we claim a shelf life. And the fear is that repeat everything with for all the time points, accelerated and real time, and it roughly runs about $30,000-$40,000 per time point for testing.
Well, that's where, when I've had to go back and do that, there are ways to look at what's already been run and try and figure out how to use that as your aging factors. So, because the aging standard actually allows you to take real-time age and then accelerate age too, to get the longer shelf life. So you need to, it's just a matter, you can't answer that question easily without looking at more information to make sure you're saying it right. I'm just really in shock over what the FDA is saying, but I have seen auditors come up with ways of doing things that make no sense. I was actually with a company once that closed the books on the auditor and asked them to please leave because they were asking questions that didn't make sense and weren't part of the CFRs. That happened to one other company. The auditor got fired. So I don't know. That's one of the reasons I enjoy working on standards committees, because we have representatives from the FDA come in and talk with us about it. And we try to make sure they understand some of the weird things that are happening so they can go back and work with the instructors for the auditors to make sure they start doing things right. And it helps. We have a packaging community where we know a lot of each other, and sometimes you get a really weird thing happening from an auditor and you can send out for anonymous help. So we all help each other when we get really strange questions that make no sense from a packaging standpoint.
Yeah, I think the best way for a company in that situation to handle it is to come up with a testing plan and include the rationale based on the standards, based on the statistical analysis, based on previous data for the product that was not claiming a shelf life, and then submit that as a pre-sub to the FDA saying we want to submit a special 510K to the FDA to extend the shelf life of this product from no claim to a specific claim of so many years. And this is the testing plan we are proposing, and get the FDA's feedback on it. But if you just ask the question, if I repeat this testing and I do this standard, will this be okay? You don't get a useful answer from the FDA. You really have to provide a protocol and rationale that's scientific behind it. And for that, you're going to need Jan's help and maybe the help of a few other people as well, because it's not a simple answer. And the FDA is not necessarily the expert.
Right. You have to train them. They don't know, but you have to train them in a way that makes them feel good. So there was a question on this. Would I have any concerns about testing at elevated temperatures of 50 or 55 C for polypropylene? And I would say 50 C is better, because 55 is getting on the edge of issues with chemical issues with your polypropylene. And part of that is because of the plus or minus tolerances around the equipment that's actually running your tests. If you're running at 55C, you might actually get up to 58C, and that is too close to 60 to not think that you're going to have chemical reactions going on with your polypropylene. So moving it down to 50 is actually a better temperature to be working at. I always try and go to 40 if I can, but usually most people can't take that much time with accelerated aging. It's just not something you can actually speed up very well. I had a question on the best practice for frequency of revalidating gamma sterilization if the materials and processes have not changed. And then they said every 10 years as a question. So it depends upon the company and their risk assessments they've conducted. Usually I see for people trying to mimic what ISO and ASTM does for their standards, which is every 5 years. They go back and do a revalidation. Though I have seen some companies do revalidation of sterilization efforts every year. I think that's a little bit unusual if nothing's changed, but that's what they do. 10 years seems to be a little bit long to me, but if you've got your risk assessment set up and no customer complaints and everything looks fine and your CEO doesn't mind going to jail in case somebody doesn't agree with them, then that's the way to go.
That particular question is confusing to me because you're already doing low dose testing every single quarter for gamma anyway. And the difference between the low dose testing and the initial validation for gamma really isn't any different.
Then you have a justification and a reason to do it less.
My argument here is you don't need to do any revalidation because you're requalifying every quarter. You're checking the bioburden every quarter. You're checking the low dose verification every quarter already. The initial validation is 3 lots with bioburden, and then you're doing low dose verification. Every quarter, you're also supposed to do another bioburden and another low dose. So there shouldn't be any need whatsoever to do any revalidation since you're doing it every quarter anyway. So I've seen that question for EO sterilization. I've seen it for steam. I've seen it for dry heat, but I've never seen it for gamma or E-beam because with those particular processes that already require a quarterly requalification, looking at your bioburden in the low dose effects.
Well, then you have what you have for your periodic review is putting all those pieces together and saying that everything's fine. Bioburden, that always brings, what are you doing bioburden on? Because you need to have bioburden on your packaging materials too, and a lot of people forget that. Especially if there's some change in the manufacturing process or a new supplier. What's your experience with performing aging studies in high humidity? Although not recommended by any standards, I have seen the company I work for has a history of aging at high humidity to test worst case. Is this an overkill? Well, that one's a hard one because they write it into their SOPs to test at a high humidity at a high temperature without realizing that what you're really worried about is the moisture content in the air, not the relative humidity. Relative humidity, the higher the temperature, the more air is actually the more water is actually in the air. And you don't want to test at something that's such a high humidity at a high temperature that when your product comes down to normal temperature, it's being rained on or having condensation happening, because that's not real life for most products. Now, there are some products that's going to happen to. So you have to evaluate, like when I did refrigerated products and we brought it up to room temperature, sometimes they would have condensate on it. So I had to make sure I tested high humidity to make sure the product survived. But if you don't have something that's going to have that kind of temperature change going on, you look for the moisture content in the air, not for the relative humidity, because there's a difference. We're trying to put something like that into the ASTM standard on aging, but I'm not clear if it's actually there yet or not, or whatever. But that's something that I work on a lot when I'm doing aging, is to check the humidity and make sure that that humidity that I'm using is actually the moisture content at the temperature you usually send the product out in, not at some kind of elevated temperature or humidity the product would never see. So hopefully that makes sure that helps. How do you ensure temperature, pressure, humidity are met during distribution? You can't. That's why you're testing worst case, trying to find out what temperature, humidity, and pressure will do to your product, and you've got to look at all that. When I was in the foods, we had a whole truckload of Swiss Miss go over the Continental Divide, and nobody checked the pressure on those seals, so all the seals blew. I had a sterile product go to China. They went up to 18,000 feet without an oxygen mask on their pilot, which we never thought would happen. We thought pressurization at 14,000 feet should be enough of a buffer, because most are done at 12,000 feet. Most air cargoes are pressurized at 12,000. So we went to 14,000, but at 18,000, it blew the seals on all of our sterile barriers, so we couldn't use them. We couldn't, and it was $2,500 each of this whole pallet load of stuff that went out. So you've got to find out what your worst case is with your distribution system you're doing and test to that. One company I went in, we did everything 2-day air when we were first doing the shipping. And then they decided they were going to put it on an ocean liner and ship it across the ocean and in a cargo bay instead of the plane shipment. And we had to revalidate our packaging because we never did it for that kind of temperature and length of time. So make sure when you're doing your packaging validation, you define your worst case quite well, because if something happens later, you need to be able to say you need to retest, or that wasn't what we expected to happen out there. And that's something you have to worry about. When you say worst case, you make sure you say normal worst case, not actual worst case, because like in an airplane, that's when it crashes, or a truck falls off a road on a mountain pass. Those are actually worst case situations. They're not something that's going to happen very often, but it could happen. And we've had some auditors ask for that information. So I always say typical or normal, worst case expected, or something along that lines, to make sure we know that we're talking about our distribution lane and normally what happens.
Jan, there was, we only have 10 more minutes until the 2 o'clock. And I thought it might be a good idea to address the question that Rick had posed. Rick had asked, when should you get somebody like yourself involved in the design process? And you weren't quite sure how to answer that. And I'll share what I would answer that question with, and then maybe you can respond to that. What I think is the company should be involving a packaging engineer at the very beginning of the process, maybe after they've got a plan for the design project. But when they're creating their design inputs, those design inputs list different standards that you're going to be doing testing to, and your product has to pass. So if you have a sterile package, it's going to have, for instance, the ISO 11607 series of standards. But you would also identify in there what the acceptance criteria would be, what the sample size should be, what might be worst case conditions that you're going to test for. So those would be some of the questions you'd be asking right up front when you're doing your design inputs before you've even started designing your product. Unfortunately, startup companies tend to go all the way to a finished product and then backfill their design history file retroactively. So they write all those inputs after the fact. And so Rick, myself, you, I think we see a lot of companies like, well, I wish we hadn't done this because this is going to create some problems and here's why. But the answer, I think, to Rick's question is when should you involve packaging engineers or let's say electrical safety or EMC or any kind of specialist in a set of verification tests. That person's help is needed at the very beginning before you design your product, so you know what tests it has to pass. And then they jump back in the project just before verification to help you make sure that, okay, before we freeze this design, are there any things that we see that are going to be a problem for this meeting this standard? But at least you are aware of the standard and you could ask questions about it as you develop the product. But if you wait until you've already developed the product, asking Jan, what testing do I have to pass? The answer might be, well, every single test you need to pass, you're going to fail because you designed the packaging this way. And it just can't pass this test, and here's why. So you really need to get an expert involved earlier than you think. And it may not be for a lot of time. It might be for a short amount of time, but if you don't get Jan involved and don't get somebody like Rick involved early enough, you're going to design a product that's going to have problems, and you'll spend more time fixing it.
Definitely. I've actually helped with some of the product design. Like I had a product at Skunk Works where they finished their package design, brought it to us and said, how we're going to put this in a package, sterilize, send it out. Well, they wanted to ETO sterilize and the product was too long to fit on a pallet. And we couldn't ETO it the way they had wanted to because we had to set it up on end because it was so long. And on end, it didn't have the physical capability of sitting like that and getting ETO heat sterilized and vacuum tested. So we looked into gamma, but they made parts that turned to hydrochloric acid in it if it got gamma sterilized. So we had that was something that I could have helped them with right in the beginning before they went to this long thing that couldn't be sterilized. And I can't hear you. You're talking about something.
We have that problem a lot with catheters where they don't coil the catheter in a package and they'll keep them linear so they don't have a set to them, a set curve to them. And they'll find out the catheter that has to be very long for invasive procedures, they have to put it on end to sterilize it because it's too wide for the pallet. And then that really makes it hard to put on a pallet, makes it hard to fit in all chambers, just a nightmare from the start. So if you're doing any kind of long products, particularly catheters, consider that right up front. Like, what is going to be your package configuration for this as a requirement? Because some products can be coiled, some cannot be. But if it's not going to be coiled and it's going to be straight, you're going to need to have special packaging considerations. Otherwise, it won't fit in the chamber at all.
And even with gamma, those are usually in buckets or on pallet loads, and they have to be steady too. I had a 4-foot long product that I worked with once, and we gamma sterilized, but we had to put it in sideways, which for the bucket for gamma sterilization because it was too long to sit up. So that meant we could put less through the sterilizer. And they got all upset with that. I'm going, well, I didn't make it 4 feet long. And then it's not just because it's 4 feet long. I've got to have packaging materials too, which could take quite a bit of room, half inch, whatever, depending upon how we do that whole product. So it gets gets a little tricky there. And that's why getting in on the beginning to help with some of that stuff, or even giving suggestions on how we could pack the stuff. Maybe it's a kit, how you can pack it so you can ship it cheaper. Or if you've got cold chain, how is that going to fit in your standard package or what you have available, so you can stack it and get the most efficient way of shipping that product, as well as passing all of the tests that you need to do. So yes, getting in the beginning, it doesn't take a lot of time in the beginning, and then we disappear for a while until it's time to do the like you said, before you get into finalizing your design.
Yeah, and everybody, usually there's an interface between the sterilization process, the biocompatibility, and the materials. But materials also impact the strength of the product, what conditions it can handle from temperature and humidity, and it's also going to impact what kind of resilience it's going to have in shipping. So all this stuff comes together, and trying to figure it out at the end is too late. You've already made some decisions that can't be unmade without delays in cost. So companies will find a way to get it through and then redesign after it should have been on the market, instead of solving that problem early in the process and anticipating that conflict. Why don't we because we're at the 2:00 mark, or almost there, why don't we give some people some chances to ask some live questions and maybe put them in the chat, because we have so many people on board.
Yes, I had somebody ask about sample size standards, and there is an E11 group in ASTM that tells you that, but it's really, really confusing. So there is a new book out by Wayne Taylor that's called Statistical Procedures for the Medical Device Industry, that actually has some good information in it, and he's respected in the FDA community. So using his statistics helps. So do we have a question from somebody else?
There was a question I had never seen before. Somebody had asked about, how do you manage Pelican briefcases that are used for demo units in terms of packaging validation?
That is like salesman testing. So I don't know exactly. I'd have to see the product and how it fit into the Pelican. Normally with a salesman, you don't do much beyond the normal testing. The biggest problem you run into is trunk stock, where they've left the product in their trunk and it gets to 5 below zero or 200 degrees out in the desert, and that causes a lot of issues with the product and the packaging. So I'm not clear what would have to be done without knowing more about the product.
Yeah, I've never seen anybody validate Pelican cases for demo units. I have seen somebody validate a Pelican case as a standard package, but it was for expensive hospital equipment. And it was a highly sensitive piece of equipment that needed calibration. Rick has a question for us.
Yeah, my question is, I've been listening as we've been going along, and building up about, depending on how you count them, 7, 8, or 9 key points. And when I would want to suggest to my clients that we contact you, and I wonder if I could email that along to you. I've got your email, and I wonder if I could email that to you. And if you have time, if you see anything that I've missed, send it back to me, because that would be, because I'm just looking at them from a design point of view. And you're absolutely right. Getting you involved at the very beginning is the best thing to do. But of course, that's not usually where I run into my clients. And I love I love the idea of having a few points at which I can say, hey, now that you're doing this, this is also a good time to consider bringing in packaging consulting if you don't already have something going on.
Yeah, because when I was trying to figure out when I needed to be involved, I came up with 20 quick questions off the top of my head. A lot of them had to do with design, but it also had to do with the equipment and logistics that they were planning on, or even warehousing, because I've gotten into places where they forgot the warehouse had to store this stuff and then ship it. And yeah, so
I would love to see those. Those would be great if you could send them to me.
Are you familiar with the questions that were in the back of the 14971 standard that ask about different hazards? There used to be 34, now there are 37, but it's just a long list of questions that they ask you to go through to identify hazards. And I was thinking most people use that for their hazard identification for medical devices. I was thinking your list of questions that you would ask sounds similar to that in terms of an approach. It's just questions to ask to identify potential hazards or concerns for packaging.
Yeah, I am not familiar with those questions, and I really would like to look at them, because when I go through risk assessments that companies have made for considering their packaging, they group things together in a way that you can't actually do anything about it. So you might have the same hole in the package, a hole in the package. Well, it isn't always caused by shipping. Sometimes it's something that happens on the production line. Sometimes it's something that happens when the customer opens it. So you have to split those things out so you can actually do something about the hazards and review it. And they don't always do that very well. So makes it good. I would like to see that.
I'll be happy to share that with you. One of the other attendees here, Jeff, he asked, as a best practice, would it be wise to involve an independent packaging engineer when planning to outsource manufacturing, packaging, and sterilization, a single-use medical device rather than rely on a contract manufacturer, assuming limited history with a contract manufacturer?
Oh, definitely, I would say so, because it's sort of like that old saying where if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And sometimes there's a little tweak that we might recommend for equipment that would save you so much time and money that the contract manufacturer just didn't think about. Or the other way around. Sometimes the contract manufacturer's got some cool ways of doing things that I haven't seen too. Sorry about that, but I like to learn too whenever I can. So, but usually it's there's something there that doesn't quite make sense, but that's just because of the way they're doing their manufacturing. So, or incoming receiving. I can't tell you how many people forget you've got to have specifications for your packaging materials, and you need to look at them and make sure they work. Like corrugated. I have so many people that don't inspect corrugated anymore. I can't believe it. I mean, I came into one company once, I opened up a box and it was so out of skew, the manufacturer joint, you couldn't even put the cartons into it. But they'd never checked anything on the incoming receiving just to make sure they could open it up and put something in there, which I thought was weird. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot of things that can be done. Contract manufacturers, I've gone in and seen where they're using the wrong equipment for measuring things. So yeah, it would be good to have an independent. And it's not, there are several other people out there like me. Most of them who have my experience now aren't working anymore because they were lucky and saved enough money. And I had 2 kids and I couldn't do that. So anything else? I know there was several other questions that were interesting, but I wasn't sure what I could do. Like,
what do you think about creating a frequently asked questions document by going through the rest of these questions and writing in an answer and then posting it on that page that we created for your interview.
Yes, that would be good, especially these MDR questions that people had.
Yeah, there was a question in there. The first one that I had on the list I sent you today, with the MDR applications needed for legacy devices in the European market, are there certain tests that companies who have already gone through this process identified as being critical? So just for people that aren't familiar with the European system versus the FDA says once you've gotten a 510K, you're not required to do any retesting unless you make a change to your product. Whereas the Europeans say that you shall do testing to the current standard, even if you haven't made a change. And so that creates a challenge because standards are always being updated. So you validated all your packaging to one standard, somebody comes up with a new version of the standard, and how are you going to make sure that you're testing that your product can pass this new version of the test? I don't know if I haven't had any experience directly with a notified body questioning the changes in old standards versus new. So let's just, for example, the 11607 standard, that's changed. If you had something that was validated 20 years ago, would it still pass the current version? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends on the product that you've designed. But if the standard is changed, then you would have to either retest for Europe, or you would have to provide a justification for why you don't need to retest. And the general clause they use is the current state of the art. So the current state of the art is usually whatever harmonized standard is recognized for Europe, and most of the ISO standards eventually get recognized and harmonized, but that's always lagging behind as well. So just because it's a current standard doesn't mean that's what the Europeans are recognizing right now. So it's a constant struggle, but I don't know if there's any particular standards that you're aware of, Jan, that where this has changed significantly for packaging requirements and packaging tests, and you should expect to have problems when you try to revalidate.
No, the 11607 has stayed pretty consistent, but they did make new changes on the labeling and on human factor testing requirements. So you have to make sure those are done with the packaging. A lot of people do it for the product, but not how the packaging actually works with it. The big thing I know that's happened with the MDRs is there's a whole bunch more labeling required. And that new labeling might mean that the label on the outside of your package has changed, or the information for use on the inside has changed, which could require you to have a different package, or you've got different sizing and stuff there that needs to be tested. So that just has to be evaluated and see how that affects your packaging that you've actually validated at some point in time. And make sure when you're doing a packaging validation, that includes all your production OQ and PQ product, as well as your distribution testing and aging. You have to look at that, and it's all those pieces pulled together. And when you're doing your validation for packaging, you've got to know your risk assessments, you got to know your incoming receiving, you have to know your handling in the warehouse before and after package use, and how the customers are going to use it too. So there's a lot of pieces in there you have to know, and you should be pointing to when you pull your validation reports together for packaging. ISO 11607 puts a lot of stuff in there that we have to point to that isn't really packaging, but it's necessary to meet the standard requirements. And a lot of people don't recognize that.
That really helps. I think we're gonna end the session just in the interest of time. I know you could go through all the questions here, but we got to let people go. And like I said, we'll create a frequently asked questions document to answer all the questions that were asked. and we'll make this recording available to everybody that attended. So thank you very much, Jan, and thank you for the audience. It was really helpful to have some questions from the audience, and we got a lot more contributions ahead of time than we have in the past. So that was really helpful.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.